Have you ever noticed in Lightroom Classic, when you're in the Develop module, just below the histogram that's in the upper right of your screen, there's some numbers. Those numbers can either read out red, green, and blue, or LAB numbers. Do you use that? If not, why not? Because I find it to be useful, and I want to show you what I use it for. So let's dive in and learn how to use the numbers that appear just below the histogram in Lightroom Classic. So here I am, Lightroom Classic. On the right side, you're going to find my histogram, and you're not always going to see the numbers there. You're only going to see them when your mouse is on top of your picture. Then your mouse moving around the image is going to cause those numbers to change. Now, those numbers are a precise description of what color is underneath your mouse. But to most people, the numbers don't really mean anything. But there's some general ideas about them that can be very helpful. Let's take a look. First, right here we have a bunch of shades of gray. These are perfectly gray. There's no hint of yellow, orange, blue, or any other color in here. So when I hover over these, look up there near that histogram and notice, see if you see anything unique about the numbers that appear when I'm on top of this. Now, they might be off by the tiniest bit. That's because this image was saved as a JPEG file, and JPEG files will shift the information a little bit as the image gets compressed. But looking at those numbers, the thing that I notice is when I'm on top of a shade of gray, they're perfectly balanced, or in the case of a JPEG file, within one or two of being balanced. And that's how you define an area that has no color, is if those numbers are balanced, then what's under your mouse has no color. So here I have a color wheel, and if I want to find the exact center of it, I'm going to look at those numbers. I'm not even looking at the image, I'm just looking at the numbers, and I'm trying to get them so that they're getting closer to matching. And I could look there and say, hey, the blue number is too low. Well, then look at my mouse. I need to move closer to blue to get to the middle. And anyway, once I get to precisely the middle, those numbers are going to match. Somewhere right close to there. There is no color. But then let's see the opposite of that. I'm going to come up here to where it's one of the most colorful areas I can find in the entire document. Look at the numbers where you see R, G, and B below the histogram. The number for R, that's red, is 100%. The number for blue is 0%. And that's what you'll find is if I go to the most colorful areas, like right in here, again, look at the numbers. Notice one of them is at 100%, another one of them is at 0. Do that over here with green, you're going to find the same thing. So what does that tell me? Well, it tells me the further they are out of balance, the more colorful an area is. And the closer they are to becoming perfectly balanced, the closer you are to finding an area that is a shade of gray with no hint of color whatsoever. And that is the concept behind white balance, and how white balance can be used to color correct a picture. That's why it's called white balance. Balance meaning a balanced amount of red, green, and blue. That's how you make gray. So the concept with white balance is to search through your image, your scene, and think about anything in that scene that in real life, if you were to walk up to it, would have no color. A white sheet of paper, maybe this gray shirt, if there's none of my skin tone blending through it or anything like that. Those are the kinds of things we can grab the white balance eyedropper and click on, and when we do, if we were to glance at those numbers, you'd find they'd become perfectly balanced, because you would have made that area a shade of gray. Let's take a look. Here I have something in the upper right of this document where if you look at those numbers over below the histogram, you're going to find if I get to the center of this, they become precisely balanced because the middle of this gradient has no color whatsoever. But as you move towards the right, those shades of gray become warmer. And as you move towards the left, they become cooler. And if I move my mouse, you'll be able to tell that's happening just by looking at those numbers. If you notice, what number is the highest? It's a warm number, red. And therefore I know it's getting warmer. But if I move to the left, It doesn't mean that going towards the cool side, that blue or green is always going to be the highest. In this case, if I glance over there, it's red, so that's not helping me so much. But one thing you should know is just as they get out of balance, you're getting into a colorful area. The further out of balance they become, the more colorful the area is. As they become perfectly balanced, you're getting into an area that has no color whatsoever. One thing that's useful to know about those numbers is the colors they represent, red, green, and blue. Those colors have opposites. And so if you ever see one of these numbers starting to dip really low, it's like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, where if one number is going really low, it's as if its opposite color is going high. And so let's figure out what the opposite colors are. Right down here in this area, I show them. Here we have red, we have green, and we have blue. And over to the right is the exact opposite of those three colors. If you were to look, and I put my mouse right here, look at the numbers in the info panel. Notice that it says 100% blue and none of the other colors. If I go to the opposite side, though, we're going to have 0 blue and all of the other colors in there, but 0 blue. If I go over here, we're going to have 100% green, and on the opposite side, we'll have 0%. And over here, 100% red, and the opposite side, 0 red. So if I ever see red, that number being really, really low, you could think of it as this image is not very warm, because red's a warm color and we're lacking that. But you could also just as easily think of it as we're getting closer to this color over here, the opposite, because it's like a seesaw or teeter-totter, where if this side's going really low or don't have much of it, it's the same as saying we have a lot of this. And that's why in your when you work with images, you open an image in Photoshop and it's in RGB mode, red, green, blue mode. But if you print it, instead of creating the image using light, you're absorbing light, so you use the opposite colors. That's why you have cyan, magenta, and yellow ink in your inkjet printer. So anyway, what the heck can we use these things for? Well, let's go to a real picture and find out. Here's an image, and in here, let's say I'm not sure if my screen is calibrated, maybe my room is painted pink everywhere or something where my eyes, I'm not going to trust them. I want to trust numbers. So I can move my mouse over this area down here. This is part of an old gas pump, and I believe that this is white. At least when I was standing there, it sure looked white. If I put my mouse on it, though, I can look up there in the numbers for RGB below the histogram, and I can tell you that is not white. Instead, there's an awful lot of green in it. The middle number is for green. You notice it's higher than the others. Also, you notice the number for blue is higher. So green and blue put together, that's a cool color. And so that is not neutral. Now, what I do oftentimes when I'm out shooting is I bring this little bitty card with me. This is the same size of a card that you see a lot of people have on their keychain to get into their gym or to have their little discount program at their grocery store. Well, you can get one of these little cards, and this is certified neutral. That means that this has no hint of color in it whatsoever, and therefore if I put it into my scene and let whatever light would be falling on this object fall on that, then I can grab this little eyedropper right here. That's the white balance eyedropper. I put it on top of that and I can tell if it's balanced. Notice this little zoomed up view of it also has numbers directly below it. And those numbers, if you don't see this zoomed up area, in the lower left there's a checkbox. It says show loop. And you could turn that on in order to get this to show up. Now, if I click the mouse button, then all it's going to do is do white balance. That means it's going to balance the amount of red, green, and blue in this area. In assuming that this area has too much green in it, it's going to make the assumption the whole image has too much green in it. And therefore, when I click, it color corrects. Now those numbers, though, they don't update when you move a slider. You got to move your mouse. So right now I see the numbers are not balanced, but if I move up and then down just for a millisecond, then you'll see them change and update. And you'll find both the numbers below that little zoomed up area and the numbers up below the histogram should have changed. And if I got to the exact spot where I clicked both areas, it would show a balanced amount. And that would help color correct the entire picture. Well, I don't always need one of these little cards to hold up in my image. I use that when I'm not certain if I'm going to be able to get the colors to look right or not. Then that's a great thing to put into that scene. But let's say I didn't have that, and I had a scene though where I recognized some stuff. Here's an old Texaco gas station, and I know that this station is painted white, and therefore I should be able to use it to do white balance. So I grab the white balance eyedropper, I move up here, and I don't have to look at the numbers. I can just tell with my eye that this area right here is not white. It's kind of a yellowish orange. If I looked at the numbers though, I could see that as well. Even if I was on a black and white screen, I could tell you that there's a lot of red in that area because red's the highest number and a little bit of green. But if I were to click here with the white balance eyedropper and then move my mouse, then I would see those numbers become balanced. But this has mixed lighting. There's lighting from these recessed fixtures that are lighting the scene, but there's also a street light just outside your view on the left side. That's what's casting the light over here. And this is also painted white. If I move over there, I can just visually tell that that area is blue. And if I click, we can color correct it. So I can do either color correct for this light source or this one. Well, what if I want to color correct for both? Well, that's when I come over here to the little icon that gives me the masking tool. I might grab my brush, and with my feathering turned way up, I'm going to paint over this image. I'm just going to say, let's use a different white balance setting for this area right here, extending up to maybe right around in here. So I'm just telling it that's the area that I'd like to paint on. Now you might not see a green overlay, yours might be a different color. You can change the color with this little icon right here. But now I can adjust my temperature in my tint, and that's white balance. Unfortunately, there is no eyedropper here to use when you're masking. I wish there was. So I can kind of just look at it and say, well, this is too yellow. So let's move this slider away from yellow until it no longer looks to be too yellow. Then I look at it and it looks to be too magenta to my eye. So I'm going to move the slider below away from magenta and see if I can visually get it to look like it's neutral. But how do I know if it really became neutral? Well, I move my mouse there and I look underneath my histogram. And I look there and I'm like, well, red and green look pretty darn close, but blue isn't high enough. And so I want to adjust this slider right here and push it further towards blue. Well, I can't do that while I have my mouse up here unless I use my keyboard. So I'm going to click on the number next to temp, knowing I want to reduce it. That's going to push it further towards blue. I'll put my mouse up here and I'm just going to use the down arrow keys on my keyboard. I won't even look at the picture. I'm instead looking at the numbers underneath the histogram, and I'm going to bring it down until that number is similar to the others. And so I get it down there. Now we're at 40, and as long as if you were to round those numbers off, they would be equal or within one of being equal, you're good enough. And so I might just bring it down and see how close I could get it, and I'm thinking somewhere right in there. Now, I could attempt to get the red number to be even closer, but in general, if you're within about 2 numbers in there, it's not going to matter. If you wanted to, though, I could click on the number below, and if I needed more red, I'd push this towards the right, which means using the up arrow key, and I might come over here and see if I could do that. But I'm close enough. Now I notice an intermediate part in here that just looks weird to my eye. Let's find out what color is in there by putting my mouse right there and looking at the numbers that are up there below the histogram. And notice that blue is higher than any of the other numbers. That means that this area has an excess of blue, and if I were to reduce it to get it closer to the others, that would look more neutral. So let's make a new mask. I'm going to go over here and say I want to use my brush once again, and it might be that they have a different brand of light bulbs being used in here, or there's another light source that is affecting that area. So I'm going to come in here and just paint where I think I see the influence of that light source. And then I'm going to come in and make an adjustment. Now, if that was too blue, I'm going to move this away from blue, but I'm going to click on the number that's next to it so I can use my up and down arrow keys to change it. And I'll move my mouse into there and I'll look at the numbers, and I see that blue is still too high. So I'll use my up arrow key until I get those things close to being balanced. And I would say right in there, I'm pretty darn close to being balanced. It could use the tiniest bit more red. So to get red, I'd have to adjust tint, because do you see that warmer color on the right side of Tint, I can hit the Tab key to move down to the next setting that is there, and then I can use the up arrow key if I really wanted to, but in this case it's not really pushing red into the image, so I don't think I'm going to do that. Now you can though figure out which slider to move in a different way, because so far we've been using only RGB numbers. Remember, they only show up when your mouse is on top of your picture. Well, if you press the right mouse button when you're on top of the histogram, you're going to find a choice called Show Lab Color Values. And that's going to change those numbers so that now instead of showing R, G, and B, which stands for red, green, and blue, it's going to have L, A, and B. Well, what's different about that is when you're in RGB, those numbers are describing both color and brightness all together. Whereas when we're in lab mode, the letter L is going to describe the brightness. Think of it as lightness or luminosity. That's how bright an area is. And then the color is separated from that. And therefore we can compare the color of a dark area to the color of a bright area without having a bunch of calculations to do on our head. In RGB mode, when you're on a dark area, all the numbers for red, green, and blue get really low because it's describing how much light you're using. If you get in a bright area, they get really high because you're using a lot of light in a bright area. But in lab mode, if you ignore the letter L, that describes the brightness. And instead, you look at A and B. Then those two alone are going to describe color, regardless of brightness. And therefore, you could compare the color of a bright object to the color of a dark object to see how different they are. But let's take a little look at how it works. So I'm going to switch back to our little test image that's here, and there's a reason why I have these two gradients in the upper left. And that's because when we're in lab mode, if I were to find the center of this gradient at the top here, and I don't know if I'll be able to find the exact center, but if I were to find it, if you were to look underneath the histogram at those numbers, ignore the letter L, because we're going to ignore brightness at the moment. Instead, look at A and B. Compare the two numbers and notice that they're almost at zero. If I were to find the absolute center of this, and it wasn't a JPEG that was distorted, it would become exactly zero when I got to the middle. That's because in lab mode, those numbers range from a negative to a positive, and zero is right in the middle. Zero means no color whatsoever. But you need to have both of the numbers at zero in order to have it be a true shade of gray. So if we come in here now and look at this gradient, if I move towards the left, I'm going towards kind of a greenish color. Look at the numbers underneath the histogram. Notice that the number A went to negative 122, and B didn't really change much. I'm going to go to the opposite end of that same gradient until I get over here by that magenta. And look at what happened in that case to the letter A. A went up really high in a positive number, and B hasn't changed much at all. So A goes between green and magenta. If I go down here to this gradient, again in the middle, if I were able to find the exact center of this, and I'll be pretty shitty at doing that, but if I could, both the numbers A and B would be zero, because that's how you describe gray. And if I were to shift over here towards this cyan color that's over here, you're going to find that the B number went into a negative number. And if I go to the right side, you're going to find the B number went into a positive. So when you talk about the letter B, it goes between this color and that color. Well, to me, that doesn't sound to be overly useful because those aren't colors I'm used to thinking about. I'm used to being in RGB mode, and I'm used to working with colors that look like red, green, and blue, but I'm not necessarily used to those. Well, I'd be lying if I really said that. Look at those colors and compare them to what you see right over here for white balance. Notice in white balance, temperature goes between blue and yellow. Look over here. One of these goes between a bluish and a yellowish. Not exactly the same, but similar in concept. If you come down here to Tint, notice on one side is green, on the other side it's magenta. Look over here. On one side this is green, on the opposite side it's magenta. It'd just be nice if the two are reversed, where this one up here right now is A and this is B. It'd be nice if it was the other way around, because then you could think of this as A and that B. But all you got to do is reverse the two. So think of this as B and think of that as A. So let's go back to our image. That one at the gas station where we're trying to figure out how to get this area to be neutral. Let's go back to our mask tool. I already have that mask. It's right here, so I'll click on it, and that dials up our little adjustment that's here. I'm going to click on one of these, and then that's just so I can use the up and down arrow keys to change the number that's there. And if I need to switch to the other one, I'm going to be pressing Tab to get down there. Just so you know, Shift Tab would send you back up. So Tab sends you down in the list, Shift Tab sends you up. And all you got to do is click on one of the numbers to begin with so that Photoshop knows you want to deal with the numbers. Then the up and down arrow keys can handle it. So I'm going to come right in here, and I'm ignoring L. L means brightness. It really means lightness or luminosity. So I'm going to look at the numbers for A and the numbers for B. And I notice by looking there, they're not balanced, which means the area under my mouse is not gray. Now, if you look at the number for A, you see it's negative 3.5. I need that to come up until it hits 0 or near it. Now, I just wish that A corresponded to the top slider, but it doesn't. It corresponds to the tint slider, the one below. So I'm going to hit Tab to get down to it. I'm not going to be looking at my picture at all. I'm going to be looking at the numbers. I'm looking at that number for A. Right now it is at -4. I probably moved my mouse slightly, and that's why it changed. And I'm just going to use up arrow key, up arrow key, up arrow key. I'm not looking at the picture. I'm looking at that number, and I'm going until it hits 0 or real close to it. That's pretty close right there. Then I notice that B is at -5.7. So I want to change it. B controls the top of the two sliders we're working with. So I'll do Shift Tab to get up there, and then I'm not going to look at the picture. I'm going to instead look at that number for B. It's a negative. I need it to be 0. So I'll use the up arrow key, and I'm going to do that and get it to be as close to 0 as I can get. And I think right about there is as close as I can get. So now I know that that area where my mouse is truly a shade of gray. And if I were to change the numbering system by right-clicking and turning off the lab color values and coming over here, I would notice the same general concept is they're going to be really close to being equal. But there's noise in here, and in fact with a JPEG file, you're going to find there's a lot of color noise. I can see pink in here and other colors, and so it depends on where our mouse is. If this is a raw file and I zoom up on it, then we'll get a more accurate view and we'll get rid of any JPEG compression that's in there. But you see how the numbers for lab are a little closer to corresponding with the temperature and tint sliders because they're shifting towards similar colors. And therefore, when I need to do white balance in what I would call mixed lighting, where there's more than one light source, maybe one of these is fluorescent, another one's incandescent, and another one is LED, and they all put out slightly different colors of light. Well, then we can use those numbers to help us out. But let's look at some other images and see how it can be useful in other ways. Here I have an image, and I'm taking a picture of my wife doing yoga, and we're in Rome, I think, if I remember right. And the problem here is the sun is coming in and hitting this upper portion of the building. Down here is in the shade. In order to get this nice and bright, this area up here ends up being overexposed. I can usually tell when that's happening by looking over here at a histogram. The histogram represents black on the far left, white on the far right, and all the other shades in between. If there's a huge spike on the right side, it usually indicates that an area has lost detail, and it will be something that is solid white. So if I move my mouse over this area up here, and I am in the Develop module, because I'm not going to see it in the Library module, Develop. Look at the RGB numbers. Notice all three of them are at 100%. That tells me there is no detail in this area whatsoever. And I could start moving down and just looking at those numbers, I can find out where we start to have detail. Right about there, we have, I wouldn't even call it detail because we're only 0.1% away from white. But I can get an idea a little bit more of where within my image am I starting to get detail by looking at, are those numbers getting below 100? But that's not all. Let's say I attempt to bring back some detail in here, because if this is a raw file, the original capture has more detail than what it's showing you on screen. And if you were to bring the highlights slider down, you're going to bring in a little bit of additional detail in the highlights, or you could bring the exposure down. And now if you look at the histogram, there's a gap on the right. We no longer have white in the picture. My question is, in those bright areas now that are no longer white, is there any color? Well, if I put my mouse on this area that used to be the brightest area and I look at the RGB numbers that are there, I notice they're perfectly balanced. So let's see if we can darken this image at all. I'm going to darken it as much as I possibly can. That's crazy dark now, but did it bring any color in there? If I put my mouse over here, notice the red, green, and blue numbers are still perfectly balanced. Maybe I can put some color in it by shifting the white balance way over to something. Well, that's going to shift the color anywhere when we truly had color information. But if I come over here to that area, notice, still perfectly balanced, red, green, and blue, which means this is just a shade of gray, and there's no way I'm going to get color in there that's from the original scene. Sure, I can get color in there. What I'd have to do if I reset these sliders is I'd have to come in here to color grading, and there I can take the highlights and darken them, and then I can push color in. But that's not going to be that useful. But at least I'd be able to see it with those numbers and the info. But let's see if maybe one of the other shots that I took on the same day might be a better one to process. I'm just going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard to switch to another image that I have. Here's a darker exposure. And I'll go over here and first look at the histogram, and I see a spike on the right telling me I have solid white in this picture. Let's see if we can recover some detail. I'll bring the highlights down and see if the spike goes away. It does. But did we get color information? Well, if I put my mouse right here, I look in the info panel, it looks perfectly balanced, which means there's no color info. And so that could be that this wall is supposed to be a shade of gray, but I think this wall is supposed to be the same as like these walls over here. Let's find out. I have an even darker exposure. I'll use the arrow keys on my keyboard to switch to it, and you can visually see the color there. And so I can come in here and now look at those RGB numbers, and I can tell there's color in there because the numbers are not perfectly balanced. And if I had lab numbers in there, the A and the B would not be at 0. They'd be deviating from 0, which tells me there's color. So sometimes trying to figure out which image to adjust, and do I need to combine multiple images together into an HDR image in order to get the detail up here that I want in the color, those numbers I find can be useful. But what I use those numbers for most commonly is when I'm adjusting white balance. Because when it comes to white balance, if you're using this little eyedropper and you're going into a scene looking for something that would be a shade of gray if you saw it in real life, like a white sheet of paper or a gray car or something like that, what happens is oftentimes the object you think would be a shade of gray in real life wasn't really. Like the white paint you paint your interior of your house with. It is rarely a pure white. Instead, if you go to the paint store, you're going to find there are dozens of colors of white to paint with. And most of the time, it's not a pure white you're using. It's a little bit warm or a little bit cool. And if you click on it with the eyedropper, you're going to find that the image as a whole might look a little bit too warm or a little too cool, depending on what it is you're clicking on. So how do these numbers help me out in that particular situation? Well, let's look. If you take a look at this area, I'm going to use the white balance eyedropper. And as long as I click on something that should truly be a shade of gray in real life, I'm going to click right here, then the image will look fine. If, on the other hand, I think something should be a shade of gray, but I'm misinterpreting the scene, instead I'm clicking on something a little bit warm, the entirety of the image will shift away from that warm tone. Because what it did is it just used lab mode up here, and when it did, it found that this side over here was pushed up high, and it moved it the opposite direction. And if I go on to something that would really be a cool tone in real life and I click on it with the white balance eyedropper, the whole image is going to become shifted to the opposite of that. And it's only if I hit something that truly should be a shade of gray. So when I'm in a picture, let's say I'm in this one here, and I come in here with my white balance eyedropper, and I'm going, well, heck, that's a white painted door. I'm going to click on it with this eyedropper. Fine. But now I can check, did that help other areas that I thought should be white? In other words, did it help this window over here that should be painted the same shade of white? Well, if I look up there in the area below the histogram, I can see that it's not quite. If you look at it, you'll see that red is a bit on the high side, blue is a little bit on the low side. And so if I click here, the colors are going to change. And I can evaluate over here on the Coke sign, on the white, is it really white or close to it? That's pretty darn close to white. Do you notice that the numbers in I'll call it the info panel because that's what Photoshop would call it, that they're very close to being balanced. So it might be that if I'm going to experiment with different places to click on, the best spot might be the one that makes the majority of those areas that I think should be white close to balanced. And the one that makes them, the majority of them, out of balance is probably the wrong place to go to. It also can give me an indication if I need to do what we did on the other service station image, where I painted in with a mask and did a different white balance in different areas. Because it could be that the bulbs inside of these pumps right here are a different color of light putting out than the bulb that's up here. And so therefore, just by hovering over and taking a look at these RGB numbers, I can see how far off they are. And if they're within 3 or 4 of each other, it's numerically, then I'm probably close enough. But if they're getting way off, then I might decide that, hey, in this area over here, I notice blue is much higher. And so I think I'm going to paint with my brush over there and get blue to be more down in line with the others, so that this area over here doesn't look quite so blue. So that's what can be helpful. Now, you know most likely that in Photoshop, you also have RGB numbers. But you're going to find that these numbers don't match the ones that you find in Photoshop. And that's simply because of what's known as the color space that your image is in. Anytime you're working in Lightroom's Develop module, it's working in what's known as ProPhoto RGB. And when you're working in Photoshop, you might be instead working in Adobe RGB, sRGB, or a different color space. And that affects those numbers. Now, the concepts are still the same though. If the numbers are balanced, then you have a shade of gray. If the numbers are maxed out as high as they can go, you have white. And the further they get out of balance, the more colorful the area is you're inspecting. And so you can still use the concepts I talked about here, but just try not to use the exact numbers. So if you see the number 50 for one of the numbers here, you open the exact same image into Photoshop, put your mouse on the exact same spot, it's not going to be 50 unless you're in ProPhoto RGB as your color space, then they will match. Then for those color geeks in the audience, you can get those numbers to match what you see in Photoshop, and you do that with something known as soft proofing. But that's a subject for a different video. Let me know in the comments below if you actually like me getting into this kind of more technical side of Lightroom and Photoshop, because I love to dive into this stuff. It's just a matter of I only want to cover what you're interested. So if you like this video, hit the bell and let me know it, but mainly type in a comment and let me know if you enjoyed it or if there's some other topic you'd like me to cover. I'm Ben Wilmore, and I'll see you next time.